Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming back for our third and final panel for the day. Today we'll be talking about threats to the geopolitical order. Members of this panel will be Mr. Dustin Carmack from the Heritage Foundation in the United States, Robert C. Castel from the Israel Democracy Institute, who serves as a postdoc fellow on counterterrorism. We have America's Energy Policy by Mr. Drew Bond, President and CEO of C3 Solutions. Professor Dr. Tamás Dezső will be along soon. He's just dropping off the Kurdish panel back off the airport. He'll be along soon. And finally, we have Danube Institute's own distinguished fellow, Professor Jeffrey Kaplan, who will serve as the moderator for the conference. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today.
Well, I just want to first off thank the Danube Institute for welcoming us here and then bringing us over from Washington, D.C. It's been a beautiful city to visit. Thank you, John. Thank you, Melissa, for everything. I'll try not to bore everybody after lunch with like a deep discussion on coding and cyber. One, that's not really what I enjoy doing. But first off, I'll ask the question that I asked everybody yesterday. Who has seen the movie Die Hard? Now, the second question is, who believes that Die Hard is a Christmas movie? That's good. So generally the consensus was yesterday it is a Christmas movie, but I bring that up only because I like to bring this up because I think it's the third or fourth Die Hard movie involved essentially this massive cyber warfare happening on the streets of Washington, D.C. You saw planes and trains falling off the rails. You saw, stoplights, all turning red. And so I think this is generally, to an extent, this is how I kind of put it, that a lot of people would envision what cyber warfare looks like nowadays, or what's happening in cyberspace, where it's very difficult to see what's happening. And so yesterday I spent a lot of time talking about what's happening in Ukraine, and I want to spend a little time unpacking what we're kind of seeing there and the lessons learned from that, because a lot of the consensus that you read on openly is like, well, we haven't really seen much, but that's actually not the case. It's a misnomer, because in the first 6 months of the invasion of Ukraine, you've seen something in the range of about 1,500 to 1,600 at least cyber attacks on the Ukrainian networks, and that also has bled over. That's a little misnomer too, is that it hasn't affected anybody else. Since then, Russia has hacked over 42 countries, over 160 different organizations. That was just actually a number from the summer, just from Microsoft, just in terms of a public sourcing of some of these. And so when we're thinking about what cyber is doing in that space, there's some interesting nuggets of why I don't think you've seen these kind of die-hard type of tactics. It's not that they don't exist. In many ways, we think of where things are going on. How could blowing an access for Russia, for example, is something that takes a significant time and resources. And now when they're targeting essentially critical infrastructure, especially here as of recently, looking at the power grids in Ukraine, they're primarily doing it through cruise missiles. So cyber is something that, it takes long times and resources that early on, Russia significantly had the capability to impact them at a more heavy rate than they did. I think some of this was a calculus that they made of what they thought intelligence-wise that they could do in short order. Some of it could have involved them not wanting to, essentially ruin some networks that they hoped to essentially take over if they were able to move on Kyiv quickly. And by the time that they had realized that it was not going to be a quick war, it was too late. The Ukrainians had done a really good job actually working with Western countries, working with NATO, working with the Americans, and a lot of Western-backed technology in terms of moving what had been prior to the war, big vulnerability of having their servers located centrally in many places for everything from corporate systems to some of their military systems. And you had companies such as AWS and Microsoft and Cisco and Oracle helping them, usually either sometimes through USAID or the UK donated money through the GCUHQ to essentially help them transfer a lot of their a lot of their data over to public servers or to cloud servers. And essentially that's helped be a bedrock to protect them from constant cyber attacks. But there's also some really interesting ones that happened over the course of time. In the very beginning days of the war, there was an attack on Viasat. Viasat is essentially, think of it as a precursor of Starlink, but it's heavily used by different assets throughout Europe for internet coverage. It's an American-based company, but this attack on a ground-based server for these satellite links, which actually provided a lot of the communications for Ukrainian military units and police forces, was hit by the cyber attack. And we saw essentially not only it affect items in Ukraine, but it also affected windmill systems in France and Germany. So I'm trying to kind of unpack some of this, is that it is more complicated than it looks. It's not over yet. Russia still contains a ton of capability in this space, and it's something that, as we've gone on, what has been working though so far has been a really good example of Western resolve to be able to work together, both government-wise, but also with corporate and essentially the commercial sector, to build in resiliency to these networks and learn a lot of lessons after what happened in 2015 when a lot of the power grid was shut down for a period of time in Ukraine. And so as we go forward, talking about the broader geopolitical map of what's happening on cyber, I wanted to kind of unpack a few different countries of concern. I spent a lot of time at Heritage focused heavily on the threat of China. And because of this, I want to give you some stats. As a lot of people think about Russia, for example, as the big player in the cyberspace, they do a lot of items to create chaos. But the little known secret is that China has more cyber capability and people dedicated to cyber operations than the entire world combined. I mean, you're talking tens of thousands of people between the PLA, the strategic forces, the intelligence units, the Ministry of Security Services in China, dedicated to major scale hacking operations that are happening 24/7, 365. And it is primarily based around building accesses that could be potentially used for targeting critical infrastructure. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where I worked at before this, noted this in multiple years reports that China has the capability to shut down possibly parts of the U.S. natural gas infrastructure for not only days but possibly a week or more. And so when we're talking about, when you saw what happened with the Colonial Pipeline hack, where it shut down, a ransomware attack on an IT server, essentially shut down 45% of the United States East Coast gas pipeline infrastructure. These are deep concerns. And so when we're talking about looking at what China is doing, but then the primary motivation that they spend a lot of their time is building intelligence. This goes to intellectual property theft, which is probably the number one concern that again, we think of this kind of die-hard type of world, but really what bothers me is both, not only in the United States, but more broadly, we see massive intellectual property, essentially degradation by the Chinese using cyber espionage. It's not just unique to them. There's other countries that do this as well, but they're particularly skilled at it. And they spend a lot of time, focused on their Made in China 2025 plan by targeting all kinds of sectors. It's not just the national, defense industrial basis of Europe and and America. They target biopharmaceuticals, biochemicals, energy sectors, healthcare sectors. Look at COVID vaccine distribution, and COVID vaccines, were being targeted. Pfizer and all these other companies were being hit with cyber attacks trying to pull this intellectual property. So as we're thinking about trying to, protecting it, there's so many other elements, minus just these kind of main critical infrastructure nodes we think of, like maybe in the power and energy space, that can be deeply affected by cyber attacks. Iran is an interesting nugget, and I want to talk a little bit about them, because they've actually, we're talking about seeing things that are happening in the critical infrastructure space. They've actually have been much more brazen than most. If you look at what has happened, essentially, it's a not so shadow war that's happening and playing out between Israel and Iran for several years now, for even longer than that. But there's been cyber attacks targeted towards Israeli water infrastructure. You saw an Iranian attempted cyber attack on Boston's Children's Hospital that the director of the FBI noted here recently in congressional testimony. And so as we're looking, at some of these kind of really interesting nodes where people think that cyber doesn't have a physical effect, it absolutely does. When a baby died in Alabama last year due to a ransomware attack on a hospital unit in a NICU ward, it was because that the nurses didn't have access to the capabilities to monitor the babies that were in that unit and their heart monitors the way that they usually have. And so as we think about data and these type of connections, cyber can have a physical effect. The former head of Cyber Command, Mike Rogers, talked about this. Think about the next nugget I was talking about, North Korea. When they attacked Sony, for example, there was barely zero difference between launching a missile to blow up Sony's servers and what they actually did to essentially nuke the intellectual property and essentially a lot of the capabilities for Sony and network, because they made a movie, about North Korea. And so as we kind of go forward, this is something that I think as a Western, our Western alliances, NATO, I talked about this a little bit yesterday, building a broader consensus of a kind of band of brothers attitude that we're kind of seeing playing out here in terms of the protection of Ukraine, especially in cyberspace. We're going to have to elevate this even further to be more resilient. And so I spent a lot of time, trying to write about these issues at Heritage, and I know that the U.S. has been kind of recovering in many ways too from the SolarWinds attack, for example, that affected essentially the Russians were able to use a supply chain attack to embed deep coded software to be able to exfiltrate data from the U.S. government in 9 cabinet agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security. We're still learning about how far that was weaving down in that into our government. So as we go forward, it's also going to be behooving on all these countries in the European Union and NATO and the United States to be building essentially zero trust into every single thing that they do. And the general wisdom too is that most things in cyberspace boil down to just basic cyber hygiene. As we try to treat, how we handle identity management, how we handle our passwords. In the case of the JBS meatpacking plant incident, the ransomware attack in the United States that happened last summer, it was because over 50 of their employees had their password as password 123. So, again, a lot of people think of these kind of sophisticated, that take significant time, supply chain type attacks. Those are definitely happening. Those accesses are being built for longer term usage. But generally, most things are just done by essentially terrible cyber hygiene. And so, this is kind of goes back to what we need to be doing together to be sharing information, building these connections and information sharing agreements between our countries. That's what has really played out here in Ukraine that's been highly successful, is the ability to downgrade information from the government on one end, and then also have at the same time the commercial sector that has tons of endpoints and are collecting different data on what's happening in these networks, being able to share it more broadly with countries, with the United States, with our military. And then, like I said, we're also able to go essentially persistently engage with these actors. And so when we're talking about, a lot of people talk about, well, is cyber just defensive or offensive in nature? Dr. Emily Goldman at U.S. Cyber Command, I had her speak here at Heritage not too long ago. We're going to have to rethink that entire concept, because it's not about offensive or defensive. It is literally a constant 24/7, 365 being persistently engaged with bad actors, because at the end of the day, the calculus of those that want to essentially attack us in cyberspace is the consequences are not there enough in terms of thinking of it as kind of like a madman strategy, or in terms of a nuclear deterrent strategy. It's easy to operate in cyberspace, and people want to try and define exploits. And so it's kind of key upon us not only to be seeking exploits for our own use and understanding of networks, but simultaneously engaging bad actors And so as we work together with this going forward, I think it's going to be vital that NATO and partners like the Quad Alliance, Quad Plus Alliance that's being built out in the Indo-Pacific are going to be vital to kind of really protect against these big actors like Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia that are not going to play by any kind of cyberspace rules that you're going to see be written at the UN. So we're not out of the woods yet. I'll stop there because I know I want to make sure we get to a lot of our other good discussions, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all this morning, or this afternoon.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Robert Castel from the Israel Democracy Institute. Please.
Oh, thanks. Thanks a lot. Okay, may I start with a confession? May I start with a confession? So I suffer from a split personality. I'm suffering from a split personality. I'm 80% practitioner and only 20% intellectual, public intellectual or scholar. I'm definitely not a scholar. Okay, so let's start from this point of departure. In my daily life, I wear more often a bulletproof jacket than this noose that we start every morning by tying a noose around our necks. It's a very, very strange Western affliction, okay, tying a noose around our necks. So I don't start this way my mornings. I start my mornings by putting on a bulletproof jacket and going out into the field. So what I would like to talk about is the imbalance of terror, a revolution in strategic bombing, that it will change the way we perceive geopolitics. But I could have thought about a much simpler title. And the title is Revolution in Military Affairs of the Cheap. Okay. We were talking in the last 20 years, my PhD is about RMAs, Revolutions in Military Affairs. And during the last conflict in Ukraine, I have realized that we are living in the age of cheap. And this age of cheap changes everything that we thought about deterrence and about strategic bombing. So let's start perhaps by shattering a myth about geography. We used to consider geography as something very objective. Mountain ranges and oceans and rivers, things that doesn't change too fast, perhaps in millions of years. Okay, now I think that we are mistaken. I believe that there is nothing objective about geography or about geopolitics. It is something that we experience through our technology. Okay, for a pedestrian, for an ancient person, the primitive man walking on foot, riding a horse, such a mountain, for instance, the Dome Mountains, okay, may be like an impassable obstacle. But somebody flying a jet will experience the same landscape, the same objective geography in an entirely different way. So if technology changes in a civilian domain and changes our perception of geography, similar changes in the field of military art and science will change very much the way we perceive geopolitics and the way we fight our wars. And there is a saying in the Bible that in the book of Judges that people were seeing mountains, the shadow of the mountains like mountains. And I believe that sometimes we are seeing the shadow of the mountains like mountains. This is the topics of my presentation. So, fast forward to our current war in Ukraine. I have asked myself, what are the three main changes that I have identified during this conflict? The first thing that changed, I believe, is in the balance, the offense-defense balance. People dealing with strategy were dealing with this question for a long time, the balance between offense and defense. And I believe that in the realm of tactics and the operational arm, defense has become much stronger. It has become much, much stronger. If I compare the current war with the one fought in the Iraqi desert, what we have seen in the Iraqi desert, very much movement, war of movement, very fluid movements. What we are seeing in Ukraine is not a return to Second World War, but a return to the Great War, where very, very few, very little movement, very difficult movement. This at the level of tactics and operational art. But what's happening at the level of strategy? I believe that at the level of strategy, offense was and remained much, much stronger than defense. How do we know? Because if you need a $500,000 Iris German missile or a AMRAAM missile to shoot down a $20,000 piece of junk from Iran running toward the power plant in Ukraine, then we have a problem. Then offense is much, much stronger than defense. It's much, much stronger. So this we will talking about. Another change is the shift between the importance between quality and quantity. Here in the West, we used to base our militaries on quality. We learned mainly through the wars of Israel in the Middle East that quality is everything, that you can defeat very big Soviet or Soviet-style armies by quality. Now, I'm not sure about this anymore. I think that we are slowly returning to an age of mass warfare. Okay, and if we are laughing about the difficulties the Russians have putting big mass armies in the fields, or the Ukrainians, I can assure you that if we will be forced to force a mass army of NATO, of the United States or Israel in the field, I won't like to lift up the hood of the car and to look what is inside. It will not be a nice sight. I think that we are not prepared either to fight a mass war. And the other thing is simplicity versus complexity. We used to base our militaries on complexity, very complex humane element, okay, highly trained fighters, and very complex technological systems. And I think that the Russians are not winning. I don't know if they are losing this war, but they are not winning this war because they lack the simplest of the simple, riflemen. People carrying rifles, that's all. This is the reason that they are not winning this war. So I think that these are three axioms that we have built our military art in the West on them, and they are shifting. I see them shifting during this war. So I will concentrate on the first one. For me, this picture is the most significant picture from the World War. What we are seeing here. I intentionally didn't bring a much more beautiful picture. There are great pictures about this, but they are fake. This is the real one. What we can see here, it's a night satellite picture of Ukraine. And the biggest feature here is that you cannot make the difference between the Black Sea and the Ukraine. It's a black spot. You cannot tell, if you don't know the geography of the area, I'm from this area of the world, but if you don't know the geography, you cannot tell what is the Black Sea and what is Ukraine. And the question is why? It is because the Russians has launched several pieces of junk costing $20,000 from Iran, and they have turned Ukraine black. Okay, by very simple and very cheap means, they have taken off a whole country, a country and a half, part of Moldavia too, they have taken them off the grid, of the electric grid, the communication grid, the water conduits, the sewage, everything, with a few pieces of junk. Now that's a big difference. That's a big difference. And this difference, I call it strategic bombing revolution 2.0. Okay, it's a new revolution in strategic bombing. Now, how did they do it? How did they do it? How did they accomplish it? They have accomplished it by the RMA of the chip. What is the RMA of the chip? First, chip microelectronics. Okay, we have seen that more and more microelectronic components are available and very, very cheap. For instance, we have the Iron Dome system that Hungary is buying now, part of it, and part of it is the electronics of toy cars. They didn't have time to put original research into it, so they bought toy cars. They have taken out the circuit and put it into the Iron Dome system. Another part of the Iron Dome system is the lifting mechanism of a junk truck. Okay, the way a elector launcher vehicle is a junk truck, basically. Okay, transformed into a military vehicle. So it's very, very cheap. We can see cheap delivery systems. Okay, very cheap drones. We have drones for a very long time. We had drones even at the end of the 19th century. We already had drones in the First World War, the Second, but now the drones are plentiful. We have a lot of drones, and they are very, very cheap. We have very cheap geospatial information, basically for free. And we have cheap nuclear know-how, and it can take this revolution in strategic bombing to the nuclear realm too. Now, there is one more issue. People will tell me, but look, the Germans attempted to do the Blitz in the Second World War, and they didn't succeed not knocking out Britain from the war. The Brits and the Americans tried to do the same to the Germans. We have seen the bombing of Dresden and Klagenfurt and Hamburg, and they didn't succeed knocking Germany out of the war. So what has changed? Very simple thing. We have simply more stuff. We have more stuff. We are more connected, more dependent on critical infrastructure, and we simply have more stuff to be destroyed. That's all. So this is the reason that what didn't succeed in 1944, for instance, in Germany, can succeed now in Ukraine. The age-old idea of Douai, Trenchard, Mitchell of winning a war simply by aerial bombardment. It is a possibility. It's not a certainty, but it's a possibility. I believe that strategic bombing and Russian strategic bombing especially is a business model too. We can see that this $20,000 drone that has to be defeated by a IRIS-T missile from Germany costing 80 times more, and it can destroy with one hit a power plant costing $5 million. So there is a very strong economic component in it. You can destroy 75, 80, 85% of those drones, no problem. No problem, because they don't cost anything, basically. They are dirt cheap. The remaining drones will do the work, and they can ruin a power plant that it is $5 million, $10 million, that it takes 5 years to build it. Now, what is this brave new age? Somebody has talked about the brave new age of Aldous Huxley. So what is this brave new age we are entering it? I'm calling it the new imbalance of terror in the international system. It's making the international system way more destabilized. The proliferation of technology making the system less stable. We are entering the age of strategic piracy. Strategic piracy. There was a late French lady, researcher called Thérèse de la Pêche. She was perhaps the most important nuclear theorist and strategist of the late 20th century, early 21st century. She died very early because of a disease, but she had very important ideas and contribution to this idea of strategic bombing and nuclear deterrence. And she has talked about nuclear piracy. But my statement is more than nuclear piracy. I'm talking about strategic piracy. You don't even have to use nuclear missiles. Okay, nuclear payloads. You can use conventional payloads and turn a whole country black. We will see great powers deterred by very small powers, even without nuclear weapons. Just think about France receiving 20, 30 such drones from North Africa. Will they be deterred to launch an operation like El Dorado Canyon, launched by the United States? Bet on it, they will be deterred. And it will blur the demarcation line between nuclear and conventional. Perhaps sometimes we'll have to use nuclear weapons to preempt the destruction of our critical infrastructure by pieces of junk flying in the air, pieces of conventional junk. And this will be our Hobson's choice. We are the question is, what is the deterrence? How can we deter these rogue actors in this new age of strategic piracy? Basically, I have no idea. I don't have answers. We have to answer the question of deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment. Basic deterrence theory stuff. How will we do the direct and the extended deterrence? How will the United States deter Russia to attack a third country, Hungary or Ukraine? Okay, by these means. The regional deterrence relationships, how will they work in this new age? The graduated deterrence, how we will demonstrate, how we'll master capability, credibility, communication, and perception. Let me share you a secret. The Russians are much weaker than us, but communicating their deterrent potential is much better. Is much better. Conventional and nuclear deterrence, they are much better communicating it. Who will dominate the escalation dominance? And who will control the passing of the nuclear threshold? Yes, and the closing thoughts. What will the global security look like in the age of strategic piracy? We will have to deal with diverse, opaque, and reckless actors, non-state actors, part of them. We will have to do deterrence by hands on throttle and stick. There is some Air Force veteran here with us, I think. So when are you flying with hands on throttle and stick? When you cannot leave to the autopilot to do the things. We cannot leave the deterrence to the autopilot. We have to do it on an everyday basis. Face and reputation will be even more important. Herman Kahn's ladder of escalation, how will advance from the status of peace to total nuclear war will become much more complicated because of the cyber domain, because of space domain. And we will live in a complexity on the edge of chaos. And the sword will devour forever. And as a closing remark, I will take a sentence from Herman Kahn that we will have to be willing to confront these challenges. And the best way to show resolve and to show willing is by willing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our next speaker, this working? Yeah. And our next speaker is Drew Bond from C3 Solutions, which is by far the best name of an institution I have ever heard. Please.
All right. Well, thank you for the compliment, and very much appreciate the opportunity to speak here at the Danube Institute. Just want to especially thank John and Melissa and your entire team for the opportunity. First time to Budapest, and certainly feel as though I'm among friends. So thank you very much for this opportunity. A little bit about C3 Solutions, because I think oftentimes people think of us as a consultant organization, and we are that in a sense. But we're really an educational organization, in some ways a traditional think tank, where we help work with members of Congress to educate them about policies and particularly free market policies. So the C3 actually stands for the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions. And you don't often hear conservative and climate together because, well, I could go into a whole different speech about that. But our primary focus is to say that conservatives actually do care about climate. We care about the environment, of course. And the best way to approach these problems is with a focus on solutions. And we believe the best solutions are free market oriented. And so I'll get into a little bit more of my remarks, but I just want you to have a little bit of that background. And last sort of intro is to say that when Melissa sent me the agenda, America's energy policy, even though I've been in energy policy since 1997, I felt a little bit intimidated by this subject because, where do you start? America's energy policy is pretty vast, and as you'll see, the pendulum does swing a number of times. So I hope that I'll hit the mark in terms of your expectations. America is a vast resource rich land with technology innovation, and we are a global leader. In less than 250 years, since our founding in 1776, we've experienced eras of energy abundance, energy independence, energy dependence, and even energy dominance. We've seen the highs of the oil boom in the early 1900s, the lows of energy embargoes in the 1970s, and the unlocking of centuries worth of oil and gas with the shale gas revolution starting in the early 2000s. In the earliest days, like most developing countries, we were dependent on wood as our one and only source of energy. By the 1880s, we were powering our way through the Industrial Revolution with coal. From 1900 to 1930s, oil was booming in places like Oklahoma, where I'm from, and enabling cars to become ubiquitous across the United States. After World War II, nuclear energy began to develop, and from 1960 to 1990s, grew to become a significant source of our electricity. Solar and wind energy, along with hybrid and electric vehicles, started to take off in the early 2000s. And at that same time, the shale gas revolution began to take shape, and America went from being a net energy importer to a net energy exporter. And, by the way, reducing greenhouse gas emissions faster than any country in the world, thanks to that technology. Today, our energy is more diversified and abundant than ever before. That said, it's ironic and certainly not lost on me that the conference organizers at the Danube Institute asked me to give a talk on America's energy policy in the context of a session entitled Threats to Geopolitical Order. It's okay to laugh or not, because, as you know, this is quite a serious subject. Energy policy is certainly top of mind to Americans, with gas prices at the pump hitting an all-time high this summer, electricity prices soaring in parts of the United States, and states like California and Texas experiencing blackouts and grid failures from record-breaking heat and historic winter storms. But that feels a bit trivial to say, as the good people in Hungary and across Europe are facing a winter with energy rationing as Putin's war rages in Ukraine. This leads me to my first point, which is that bad climate policy is a threat to geopolitical order. Or put another way, bad climate policy is potentially worse than bad climate change. To be clear, I'm not saying that climate change is not a risk. It is. And I'm not saying that all climate policy is bad. It isn't. But not all policy is created equal. And policies that deny free markets to function by dictating winners and losers based on policy goals that are political in nature and primarily focused in the near term without regard for how we're going to achieve those are dangerous. Look no further than to Germany and the overzealous climate policies that defied common sense. In the name of saving the planet, Germany's green climate energy policies have put its people and the planet in serious peril. Germany's politicians shut down their coal and nuclear plants, doubled down on solar and wind, and turned to Russian gas for baseload and backup electricity generation. As a result, Putin was enabled to invade Ukraine, cut natural gas supplies to Germany, and now all of Europe is experiencing an energy crisis with few options but to turn its coal power plants back on and to ration energy, leading into a worrisome winter. In America, we don't have it perfect either. At best, and when we are at our best, America's energy policy is free market oriented and encourages energy abundance, competition, and consumer affordability and energy security. At its worst, and all too often, America's energy policy is overreactionary, politically myopic, short-sighted, and even schizophrenic. In just a few short years, we've gone from a president who promoted an energy policy based on an all-the-above, energy dominance approach to a president that sees climate change as an existential threat, like an asteroid hurtling for the Earth, for which we should pull out all of the stops with his all-of-the-government, everything-but approach. That, together with Medicare for all, by the way, will save the planet. In America, President Biden has declared that he will end fossil fuels. To back it up, he immediately canceled the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline from Canada to the U.S. He threw out reforms to the federal permitting process that would have greatly accelerated all types of energy projects. He stopped drilling and new permitting on U.S. federal lands. He asked OPEC to increase production while at the same time depleting the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in an effort to reduce gasoline prices just months before an election. And now, just a few short days ago, he gave Chevron permission to produce and export oil from Venezuela. That's a lot to take in. So let me, if you'll allow me, review and expand a little bit on these points. On the Keystone XL pipeline, even President Obama's Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers, recently said that, quote, "It's kind of insane that we are not building pipelines instead of moving oil and gas with trucks and trains." If you care about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, pipelines are far better than filling the roads with diesel trucks and trains. On permitting reform, the reforms that President Biden threw out would have accelerated energy projects in the U.S. of all types, including solar, wind, pipelines, small modular nuclear reactors, LNG terminals, you name it. But because they would also have accelerated permitting for oil and gas, and that they were devised under the Trump administration, they were completely thrown out. On stopping drilling for oil and gas on federal lands, both on onshore and offshore, while at the same time President Biden, who was seen as begging OPEC to produce more oil, he was preventing the production of oil and gas in America and depleting our strategic petroleum reserves during a global energy crisis, all to lower gas prices at the pump weeks before the elections. Adding insult to injury, in his recent decision just this week to allow a major oil company to produce and export energy from Venezuela, a country known to be corrupt and led by a ruthless dictator. How is that for energy policy? To be fair, President Biden's agenda has also been proactive in that he recently signed into law a record-breaking $400 billion spending bill touted by many environmentalists as the most important climate bill in history, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. And while there's a lot to not like about it from a free market perspective, I will give it that it at least takes a broad and almost all the above approach that includes funding across the board for research development, deployment, not just for solar and wind, biofuels, electric vehicles, but also for grid resiliency, small modular nuclear reactors, energy storage, hydrogen, and carbon sequestration and utilization. President Biden also signed another $280 billion into law with the CHIPS bill, which subsidizes American-made semiconductor manufacturing and spends more money on scientific research. Together, these laws make up the most aggressive industrial policy that America has seen in the last 50 years. So historically, America has seen presidents and their energy policies come and go. And so allow me, if you will, to tick through some of these, and I'm going to leave out, I'm sure, many important points in these administrations, but to try and summarize the pendulum that has swung over the last several decades, I'm going to hit just a couple of top lines. President Nixon signed one of the most sweeping environmental protection laws into place called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. For more than 50 years, NEPA has served a purpose in protecting the environment. In that same time, it's also slowed down clean energy projects, adding hundreds of billions of dollars to nuclear energy projects, and ironically, has been the cog in the wheel for addressing climate change as it relates to technology. President Jimmy Carter mandated gas rationings, created the U.S. Department of Energy, and invested in alternative fuels in response to the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries oil embargo, and put solar panels on the roof of the White House. President Reagan removed price caps, lifted regulations to allow the free markets to work, did create the Synfuels Corporation in a failed attempt to develop synthetic fuels, and removed the solar panels from the White House. President George H. Bush led the fight and rallied the United Nations in Desert Storm, defending freedom, democracy, and access to oil. President Clinton gave us the first climate czar in Al Gore, who made millions with his gloom and doom movie, The Inconvenient Truth. President George W. Bush, for whom I had the honor to serve, declared an end to America's addiction to oil, signed the first major energy bill into law in over 10 years, pursued a hydrogen economy, and signed the Energy Innovation and Security Act, which significantly increased America's R&D and grid security budgets and accelerated the growth of intellectual property in the United States. President Obama threw record amounts of money at renewable energy, shovel-ready projects when he signed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, economic stimulus bill, into law. He stood up the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy and signed the Paris Agreement. President Trump canceled the U.S. participation in the Paris Agreement, imposed tariffs on Chinese solar panels, opened up drilling in the United States, passed a sweeping tax reform bill that had an unreported positive impact on energy efficiency and clean energy, and pushed ahead on offshore drilling, the Keystone Pipeline, permitting reform, and virtually anything that bolstered his energy dominance agenda. All of these policy pendulum swings were responses to real or perceived geopolitical threats in one form or another. And all of them were made in the context of one of the biggest movers of American energy policy, the price of oil, or you could say the price of gas. Consider the price of oil over the last 50 years. At the start of the 1970s, when I was born, oil was $2.75 a barrel. A decade later, it had reached $25 a barrel. By 1999, oil had dropped back down to $8 a barrel. 1 year later, in 2000, it was up to $30 a barrel. After 9/11, oil dropped to half of what it had been the year earlier, to $15 a barrel. In 2003, it was 30. 2004, it was 40. 2005, it was 50. By 2007, it was $99 a barrel. In 2008, it reached an all-time high of $147 a barrel. And by the end of that same year, it had dropped to $36 a barrel. Follow those price swings, and you'll find a trail of American energy policies. Now, all of this reminds me of a saying in Oklahoma. If you don't like the weather, just wait a minute. And if you've been to Oklahoma, you know this is true. Although energy policy changes on a time scale of decades, not minutes, the reality is that if you don't like America's energy policy, just wait a year or 2 or 10. Now, while presidents and the oil price clearly have set the tone for American energy policy, it's important to know that America's energy policy is not monolithic and therefore cannot change overnight. Rather, it's made up of a patchwork of policies and policymakers that start at the local, city, and county and state levels and rise up to the regional and federal levels. The United States of America has 19,495 cities, 3,143 counties, and 50 states, all having a say in energy policy. And please don't forget the Congress. Congress has more committees that have a say on energy policy than any other issue. So while the policies of presidents can come and go relatively quickly, the policies of Congress ebb and flow and can take decades to change. Fundamentally, the best and most durable energy policy is the one that recognizes that energy security, economic competitiveness, and environmental stewardship are inextricably linked. People and economies need access to abundant energy to flourish. And that energy must enable us to be a good steward of the environment in which we live. Now, one could say the same about climate policy. It must recognize that if we are to minimize our impact on the climate and the environment, we must have access to not just clean energy, but also abundant and affordable energy. Without energy security and economic competitiveness, responding to the changing climates will be a luxury left to the elite. Which leads me to my final and most important point. The best energy and climate policy is economic freedom. Economic freedom is the solution to all of these problems. As our analysis is done at C3 Solutions, called Free Economies Are Clean Economies, in this report, we took the Index of Economic Freedom from the Heritage Foundation and the Environmental Performance Index from Yale University. And when you correlate the data, you find that economic freedom leads to a cleaner environment. And not just by a little, but by a lot. Countries that are economically free are twice as clean as countries that are economically unfree. So if you really care about the environment, if climate change is the most important issue that we must address, economic freedom is the solution. This is especially true because the greatest energy and climate challenges in the future involve developing world countries. These countries demand and deserve to grow economically. And at the same time, these countries demand and deserve a better climate and environment. So if you care about climate change, economic freedom is the answer. If you care about energy security, economic freedom is the answer. If you care about your country's economic competitiveness, you guessed it, economic freedom is the answer. Fundamentally, the best energy policy for geopolitical order, and moreover, for a flourishing people and planet, is one that embraces and expands economic freedom. Economic freedom truly is the answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker needs no introduction, really, and has been introduced twice already over the last few days. But Professor Tamás Dezső, who leads the Danube Institute, the Migration Institute, teaches at MCC, and does many, many more things that I certainly couldn't count, is our next speaker. Dr. Dezső.
Thank you, Jeff. Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, my morning address, I promise you that I'm going to repeat my motto for this day as many times as I can. So let's start it. It's a biblical passage from the book of Ecclesiastes. There's a time for everything and a reason for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace, a time to refrain from embracing. A time to search and a time to give up. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear and a time to mend. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. This slide shows, it seems that this slide shows a map of Eurasia and Africa. On which map? It's my map. The Muslim countries which I'm going to concentrate are indicated in green, and European countries are indicated in blue. Dark blue are the EU members. Some of you mentioned Zbigniew Brzezinski today morning, and if I look at this map, it could be a global chessboard on which, interestingly, more than 2 players are playing a global geographical chess game. The number of players, it's quite interesting because in the original version of Brzezinski's theory, there were at least 4 players: United States, Russia, China, and Europe. And I don't know how many players are around the table at the moment. But are we still players, I mean the European, or not? On this geographical, geostrategical map, as on a normal chessboard, there are key positions to be controlled to win the game, as in a normal chessboard. Brzezinski listed some of these key positions. One of them one of them was Ukraine. Ukraine is not the topic of my lecture now, not that day. Ukraine is a geostrategical position which should be controlled. If you perceive this one as a large system, there are subsystems which can be studied. I would like to study 2 or 3 subsystems today, and the most important, the next one is the demographical subsystem, because we are talking about the overpopulation of this Muslim region and other regions. All my numbers are coming from the UN database, Department of Economic and Social Affairs, Population Division. You can find on the website of the UN in Excel format. It's a database, so you can use it, work with them as an Excel. This chart shows pre-COVID position, pre-COVID dates, and you can see a few selected countries are indicated, and the percentage of the growth of the population between 1955 and 2018 was a huge number. I mean, between the lowest is 344%, and the largest one is 943%. An average of 500% was the growth during these 70 years. The yearly population growth is very important. For example, in Pakistan, the population grows every year with 1.93%, almost 2% per year. It means the population of Pakistan grows with 3,800,000 people per year. It's a net growth. The population of Pakistan grows with the size of the population of Hungary every 2.5 years. The median age. In Afghanistan, the median age at that time, now the number of the population of Afghanistan is 36 million, and the median age is 17.6 years. 17.6 years for 36 million people. In Europe, it's well over 40 years. The next one is the fertility rate. In Afghanistan, it's 5.07. The lowest rate in Morocco, still very high. You know, the ideal typical is 2.2 when a population can survive with this 2.2 fertility rate. These fertility rates are much higher. Let's see the same numbers, the same countries. What's going to happen till 2050? You can see the numbers. How large are they going to be? All the prediction forecasts are from the United Nations, medium variant. The population of these countries, Middle East and North Africa, 27 Muslim countries I'm talking about, was 685 million. And according to the UN predictions, the population of these regions is going to grow further with 403 million people, almost the size of the EU, within the next 28 years. The Gallup published a poll, a willingness to migrate, a willingness to leave the region. And we said these are, I don't know what did they, I haven't seen any Gallup poll after the COVID disease, but these numbers are really indicative, you know, steadily growing numbers, and the 33% of the Sub-Saharan African people who were polled by the Gallup said that we are ready to migrate, we are ready to leave our country. The same number is, the same question, the answer for the same question was 24% in Middle East and North Africa, there in the MENA region. Let's see these numbers on the map. This is the fertility rate. Dark blue is, the number is well over 6. It means one couple, husband and a wife, are going to have 6 children. The lowest rate is under 1.5. You know, the Middle African region and the MENA region is affected with these numbers, and the population is just decreasing in other parts of the world, especially in Europe. The balance is quite interesting, not interesting, it's striking. The next slide shows the median age. It's quite clear from this map that the highest median age you can see in Germany, Italy, and Japan, where the median age of the population is well over 45 years. There are countries, a lot of countries in the Middle East and a lot of countries in Africa where the median age is between 15 and 20 years. Quite young societies. Quite young societies. Samuel P. Huntington wrote that if in a given society, the ratio, the percentage of the young male population between 15 and 25 years reaches around 20%, there's going to be an armed conflict. Religious war, war of independence, civil war, any kind of armed conflict. If you look at this slide and you can look at this map, you know, this percentage is very high in African countries, well over 10%, and very low in European countries and in Russia. If you look at this map, this percentage of the young male population between 15 and 25 years is very high in Afghanistan, very high in Syria, in Iraq, Syria, Sudan, and Yemen. These are the conflict zones of the Muslim regions. These are the conflict zones where religious wars, wars of independence, and other conflicts we can see or witness. The next slide, my next slide shows the growth of the population till 2050. And you can see the largest numbers in Africa and the Middle East, North Africa. And the smallest numbers are obviously in Europe, Russia, and in China. So the population of some African countries is going to grow with 200% during the next 28 years. And there's going to be a decrease in the populations of European countries in Russia and in China. The overall growth of the African population is going to be 1,074 million, according to the predictions of the United Nations. 1,074 million. The next slide shows the annual rate of population change, year by year. Some countries produce a yearly growth of 5 by 10%, and some countries shows nothing. A decrease, not a growth of the population. Let's see how does it look like in a 2-children model, a 3-children model, and a 5-children model. This is the fertility rate. One couple has got 2, 3, or 4 children, or 5 children. In a 2-children model, which is the characteristic of, or it would be very nice to be if it would be a characteristic of the Western world, a couple has got 2 children, 4 grandchildren, and 8 grand-grandchildren. Let's see in the 3-children model, 3, 9, and 27. The third generation is 27, which means 27 descendants. How does it look like in a 5-children model? 5 kids, 25 grandchildren, 125 grand-grandchildren. Is there anyone who has got 25 cousins? 125 cousins? No? In Afghanistan, it's a normal phenomenon. The other problem that, fortunately, in the Western world, ladies bear child at the age of 25 or even 30 or later. So in the Western world, there are 3 generations within a century. But in Muslim countries and Africa, there are 4 or 5 generations per century. That's why I do not use the fertility rate. I use much more the yearly change. Because you can detect the changes much better in the yearly change. With the fertility rate you can use to compare societies between the Western world. But you cannot compare the Western way of establishing families with the Eastern way or African way of establishing families. 125 descendants in the 4th generation, and not 16. That makes a difference. Next subsystem, next aspect I would like to talk about is the voter stress. The original map, it's my map, but the original map was published by the World Resources Institute in 2013. This is the old world, and this map indicates a huge, high or extremely high loss of sweetwater reserves in the region of the Capricorn and Cancer. Southern part of Europe, North Africa, Middle East, China, even India, South Africa, Australia. With other colors, the gray is deserted and the green is the fertile part of the world. This was the Euphrates River, which is a stream otherwise, in the summer of 2019. In Syria, this was Euphrates River in Iraq, September 2019. I go to Iraq every year for at least a month, so I see what's happening. There was no rain for 7-8 months. I asked my Kurdish guests, is there rain in Kurdistan? And they told me that, yes, yesterday. We got the first rain, late November. The problem is the decrease in rainfall, and then the other problem is that the neighboring countries block the rivers with dams, fill in the reservoirs, to use them for irrigation purposes, to irrigate the lands, to produce food for the ever-growing population. This happened in Turkey and in Iran. Turkey blocked the Euphrates River and the Tigris River, and Iran blocked the other rivers. And actually, there is no water in Iraq and Syria. This is the world map. This is the original map. It's my drawing, but the original map of the World Resources Institute. It is a political map, that's why Alaska is indicated red. But the United States is going to suffer a huge, tremendous loss of sweetwater reserves, 40% or something. The same map is shown with other colors. And I promise you not to talk about Ukraine. According to the forecast of the World Resources Institute, Ukraine is going to dry up completely till 2040. Completely. Ukraine is going to lose 40 or even 50% of the sweetwater reserves. There's going to be no rain because the climate is continental. All the remaining waters are coming from, of Ukraine are coming from Belarus and Russia, all the rivers. And Belarus and Russia is going to build dams to block the water, to irrigate the fields. And the geostrategical position of Ukraine is going to change fundamentally. Ukraine is going to not to be the breadbasket of the world. I've got quite important things to talk, to tell you about Ukraine, but this is not the day. But the geostrategic position of Ukraine, which was pinpointed by Brzezinski some 25 years ago, is going to change fundamentally. If I know this map, everyone knows this map. The strategies of the United States, the strategies of Russia. If you don't believe, there are some other documents you can check. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN published this progress on level of waters. It says it's 21, shows the same picture. Ukraine is going to dry out completely till 2040. This is a map just to illustrate the largest exporters and importers of wheat. This is a map which shows the largest exporters and importers of rice. In some of the African countries, the starving regions, the staple food is not the wheat. This is the problem of Ukraine. Not the wheat, but the rice. Because what are the poor people do with a sack of wheat? They should grind it, bake it. And refugee camps, there are no mills, there are no ovens. They need a sack of rice to boil and eat. Another question, what's going to happen with this fantastic, dramatic, and otherwise very good expansion of the electric vehicles? Bloomberg's JP Morgan forecasts the economies of those 27 Muslim countries which I'm talking about based almost exclusively on the commerce of carbohydrates, oil. I don't know what's going to be the reaction of the oil markets for a substantial drop on the market. Who needs fuel? These are the numbers for 2040. There's going to be a hole in the budgets of these 27 countries, Muslim countries, which are actually overpopulating. It's a huge boom of population. Otherwise, drying out completely. And the most important income is coming from the commerce of fuel, of crude oil. What's going to happen to them? There's going to be, I think, a crisis period. This is just a graph, I made it. Loss of water, growth of population, and decrease in the income of oil industry. Within 25 years, within 10 or 15 years, there's going to be a boom and something is going to happen in the Middle East. Just return back to the map. The MENA region is going to produce, or the growth of the population is going to be 403 million. The African region, in the African region is 1,074,000,000 according to the forecast of the United Nations Population Division. Numbers are not mine. UN numbers I use exclusively. This region looks like a steam boiler. The pressure is just growing and growing within the boiler. The northern neighbor of this region is Russia, which has got its own Muslim minorities, and the Russians are going not to let to enter Russian territory not a single Muslim refugee or migrant from this overpopulating region. Not a single. They're going to solve the problem in Siberia. The eastern neighbor of this region is China, which has its own Muslim minority, the Uyghurs, who are separatist in nature, and the Chinese government is just fighting with them. The southeastern neighbor of this region is India, which is actually in a state of war with Pakistan. There's a ceasefire at the moment, as far as I know. The Indian government is going not to let not a single Muslim refugee or migrant to enter India. No one wants to go to Africa. The only way out, the only valve, is a way towards Europe. See this map. The greens are the fertile regions. Amazonia is going to be fertile till 2040. But the jungle is not an ideal typical place for agriculture. The same applies to Central Africa. The two largest green patches on the world map is Canada, where there is enough room for another 500 million people, and Russia and Siberia. Countless resources, fields, agriculture, minerals, wood, water, everything. So the geostrategic position of Russia is very good. Is there an interest to help these countries, the MENA region, investments, revitalize the economy, create jobs, to let the people stay at home, not to try to go towards Europe? In 2017, there was a conference in Iraq when one of the directors of one of the rebuilding agencies, Iraqi rebuilding agencies, his name was Mustafa al-Hiti, said that the complete rebuilding of Iraq after the war with ISIS is going to cost $82 billion US. 80 million euro, which the German government spent during 4 years to supply and help those refugees, migrants who ended up in Germany, 1.2 million around. As far as I know, no one wanted to invest into Iraq to revitalize the economy, to create jobs, and let the people stay at home. This applies to all the other countries. Is it surprising? I don't think so. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down. It hastens to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind. And when it circuits, the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they are flow again. What has been, what will be. And what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Ladies and gentlemen, it was a very great privilege to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Take a minute to let all of that sink in. Professor Dezső's talk really very, very well demonstrates why global immigration flows constitute one of the greatest threats to the geopolitical order today. The dimensions of the threat are deeply controversial and are perceived very differently in the West than they are in Africa or the Middle East. It is a problem that has generated voluminous literature from academics, NGOs, and governments, each written, it seems, with a particular agenda and a set of policy objectives already in mind. What is most remarkable about this literature is that it exists largely in a closed circle of producers and readers. In other words, those who write, read, and those who read, write. The target audiences are governments and international organizations, and the ultimate objective is to affect policy. The public reads little of this literature, but the public does have very strong views on the threats posed by immigration. Those views and those fears have shaped elections and caused many EU countries a massive shift to the right, with heretofore marginal parties whose views were once considered beyond the pale of acceptable popular discourse becoming, with suitable shifts in rhetoric and leadership, powerful parliamentary blocs. In the early 1990s and 2000s, for example, I spent considerable time in Sweden and Finland. In Sweden, I was doing participant observer research with the most violent fringe of the radical right. Later, while teaching at a college in the furthest northern corner of Alaska, whose Inupiat Eskimo name is even more unpronounceable than our Hungarian names for most foreigners, I commuted bi-weekly to Stockholm to work in the office of the Prime Minister on the Stockholm Forum for Anti-Semitism, which took place in January 2000. It was quite a juxtaposition, going from a village of 2,000 with no paved roads to a major European capital, and, not incidentally, a nice, warm, comfortable hotel in the heart of Stockholm. But the most jarring changes were yet to come. In the 1990s, I interviewed the founding members of the Sweden Democrats, a party that was less Swedish than Germanophile and far less democratic than explicitly National Socialist. In simpler terms, they were Hitler cultists who dreamed of bringing back the Third Reich. In the 21st century, under new leadership and benefiting from Sweden's chaotic immigration policies, the 2015 immigration crisis, the near collapse of overburdened health and social welfare agencies, the rise of crime and urban violence, which saw, according to the World Population Index, Sweden become the nation with by far the highest rates of rape and sexual assault in Europe, much has changed. Today, the Sweden Democrats hold 73 seats in the Riksdag. This is second only to the Social Democratic Party. Sweden, once the most liberal country in the EU, and a place that in the 1960s Time magazine declared to be the ideal country in the world in which to live, has made a massive shift to the right, and the fallout from immigration is a major reason. Finland, too, has made such a shift, although less because of immigration, which they regulate as carefully as Hungary, although with much less criticism than Hungary gets for many of the same policies, as from fear of immigration and change. As the Fulbright Bicentennial Professor at the University of Helsinki, I again interviewed the radical right, including the true Finns, which many of my academic colleagues in the early 2000s were not even aware of. They were an interesting collection of fanatics and mystics, with ideas ranging from a kind of Nordic National Socialism to a neo-pagan idealization of the national epic, the Kalevala. Today, the true Finns have been transformed into the Finn Party. Under new mediagenic leadership, the Finn Party holds 38 seats in the parliament. This is only 2 less than the Social Democrats and ties them for second in parliamentary representation with the National Coalition Party. It's a remarkable change. As you might have heard, Hungary too has definite views on immigration. In an especially provocative challenge to the West, Prime Minister Orbán, in a speech at Tusványos in Romania last summer, recommended that his listeners read The Camp of the Saints, a 1973 French dystopian novel, which has been recently translated into Hungarian. The novel posits Europe being so overrun with immigrants that Christian European civilization is swept away in a great apocalyptic Sturmendammerung. EU and even American opinion was less enthusiastic about this choice for summer reading. That global immigration flows have since 2015 had a seismic impact on European politics is beyond doubt. And much of the literature referenced at the beginning of this talk focuses on immigration. The impact of immigration on the countries of the South, especially the Middle East and Africa, is understudied and, truth be told, little known in the West. This is the starting point of a major research project now in the formative stages of the Danube Institute. The Danube Institute has undertaken 3 major research projects in the last several years. The first, now complete, was Anti-Semitism in Hungary, Appearance and Reality. In this project and major conference, Danube Institute researchers interviewed the leaders of the Hungarian Jewish community and produced a 2-volume work published by the Helena Historical Press in the United States. Following the data, the research, based on interviews and the literature, found that the widespread reports in the foreign media that Hungary is a dangerous place for Jews to live and that the atmosphere of violence and intimidation is either orchestrated or manipulated by the Fidesz government was in fact false. Indeed, the European Jewish community recently published its own study confirming our findings, declaring Italy and Hungary to be the best and safest places for Jews to live in the EU. The second project, now underway, is titled Attacks on Christian Communities and Institutions. With very much appreciated assistance from Hungary Helps, it consists of an in-depth research and fieldwork in 6 countries in the EU, Middle East, and East Africa. The basis of the project is to study the issues underlying violence against Christians without the political or policy agendas that are so prevalent in this literature, and in fact so prevalent that many, including many EU states, refuse to recognize the reality of anti-Christian violence altogether. The study examines 3 aspects of the problem: internecine violence, in which different factions of the Christian community clash; intercommunal violence, in which there is violence between religious or ethnic groups within a state; and true Christian persecution, which is a relatively rare phenomenon, in which the violence emanates directly from state actors or through state-sponsored proxies. The most recent project, now in its formative stages, is by sheer coincidence also the title of this talk: Extremism, Immigration, Emigration. Our partners in this project would surprise many outside observers whose understanding of Hungary is shaped by the same Western media sources that push the Hungary as anti-Semitic trope. The Islamic World Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, ISESCO, and the Moroccan Observatory on Extremism and Violence. The Danube Institute has memorandums of understanding with both. ISESCO is particularly interesting and very supportive. It has 61 member states throughout the Islamic world and offices in over 30 countries in the EU, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Its works are many and varied, but what is most striking is how, on a remarkably global scale, it mirrors in many ways the work of our own Hungary Helps, combating extremism and violence through development projects undertaken in consultation with the host communities, rather than simply being parachuted in, replete with cultural assumptions and policy prescriptions from the donor states. What makes such a partnership possible for the Extremism, Immigration, Emigration project is its unique structure and conscious effort to avoid Western cultural assumptions. The project does not seek to document every aspect of immigration, emigration, and the entire dynamic of population movement, but will focus on the drivers that create extremism and instability that, after purely economic and human factors, as illustrated in Professor Dezső's presentation, the violence that drives immigration flows. In the first stage, the project will form research cadres made up of teams of EU, Middle Eastern, and African researchers working together to give a north-south view of 5 specific questions. economic development as a check on extremism and violence, religious conflict and tribal conflict, civil conflict and civil war, EU immigration policies, and maybe most important, the social, economic, and developmental impact of immigration in Africa and the Middle East. The research will balance the sources and ideas of North and South, EU, Africa, and the Middle East in researching each question. This allows us to examine not only the impact of immigration in the EU, but also the damaging effects of emigration on the affected countries. The research cadres will operate primarily in the first stage by Zoom meetings, but there will be workshops, physical conferences, and researcher exchanges throughout, which will allow for considerable personal interaction for the researchers, but perhaps most important for the researchers themselves to gain experience in both cultures, North and South, and to see the world through the eyes of the other, in which I think is key to reaching their conclusions. The second stage will consist of field work in selected nations. As with the Christianity Project, researchers involved in the field work will talk to all communities, including governments, NGOs, religious institutions, and community groups, as well as affected families. The ultimate objective of the research is to produce a set of texts that will become a definitive source of knowledge for the academic and policy communities alike. The structure of the project, putting researchers from the North and South together to produce research that does not reflect the views and preconceptions of one region or the other, will be unique in the field. And finally this. Over 2 conferences in 3 days, our speakers have explained in depth a number of the issues and problems regarding geopolitics, security, economics, and much more. Tomorrow I will take a deep dive into global jihadism and join the parade of gloom. Today, though, I wanted to take a few minutes at the end of the very last panel of the first day of this conference to tell you about some of the work of the Danube Institute and to explore and better understand at least some of the issues and help in our own way to work towards solutions. Thank you very much for your attention and your patience.